European finance leaders. Job vacancies fall at the fastest rate in over a year as tax rises for employers comes into force. And how UK planning rules could bypass councils to fast-track house building. A very good morning on this Monday Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey. Now, Rachel Reeves is expected to say that she wants a business-like relationship with the European Union when she meets European finance leaders later today. She'll be the first British Chancellor to attend the summit of EU finance ministers since Brexit. Speaking in Brussels, she's expected to champion free trade and call for a strengthening of economic partnerships. But despite the government's push to rebuild closer ties with Europe, ministers have ruled out returning to the single market, the customs union, or allowing the free movement of people. Well, let's get more on this. Let's speak to Helen Thomas, the chief executive of the business inside firm Blonde Money. Helen, very good morning to you. If we're not going to change the fundamentals of our relationship with the EU, what do you think the Chancellor's trying to get out of this new relationship with the European Union?
Well, let's be honest, Rachel Reeves needs a bit of a win, doesn't she? Because ever since the budget, there's been quite the slew of negative headlines. You've touched on a few there. I'm sure you'll be talking about that job survey that looks pretty bad. But look, yes, she needs a win, and it's about the mood music, as it often is with these EU summits. I think that's what she'll be going for.
Oh, and when you talk about the mood music, that is essentially trying to win EU member states over by just simply being more positive about them and suggesting that they want to get rid of the acrimony that we've seen, I think it's fair to say, since Brexit.
Well, I think there is, with these big meetings that you have at these international levels, I do think there is something to be said for diplomatic approaches into trying to improve relations. But, just sort of saying we're not going to be fractious anymore. Well, I think, you led with this. They're not, the Labour government is not proposing a significant change in the way that Britain is outside of the European Union. And in fact, what we're expecting from her speech today is some comments on, for example, food standards and veterinary standards, which is hardly likely to get anybody's pulses racing.
Indeed, and that's why I come back to my, I suppose, fundamental point here, which is nothing significant is going to change, despite that mood music, if we're not prepared to move, surely, on some of those fundamentals. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe actually the Labour government do think that they could incrementally get more and more things by being maybe useful outside the sphere of economics. There's often been talk, hasn't there, that actually Britain as a military player is quite big, particularly in Eastern Europe, given concerns about Russia, and that actually the UK diplomatically could chip away at certain EU countries.
Well, look, let's all be honest here. The world changed after November 5th with Trump coming back into the White House. You're just seeing all of these dominoes falling all over the board, aren't we? With everything that's happening in the Middle East, China, Russia, all of these massive, massive countries. So there are huge opportunities when this sort of thing happens, but there will be big winners, big losers. There's going to be a trade war of some kind coming down the line here from that new Trump White House. So I think it's quite interesting that, Rachel Reeves is taking this moment to go and visit the EU, which are themselves having a huge issue with the fact France and Germany have, frankly, no functioning governments. So even if she did think she could change the mood music, there isn't even anyone at the helm of the two largest economies in Europe to offer anything back. So it's a little bit surprising in that scenario.
Yeah, indeed. Olaf Scholz, particularly, is probably almost certainly not going to be German Chancellor for much longer. And that's why there's been criticism, hasn't there, of this visit, that Rachel Reeves, instead of going to Washington and getting to meet the incoming Trump administration, that she's prioritising, it seems, Brussels.
Absolutely. I mean, I think here, there could be an angle where France and Germany, as I say, have no government. Europe is really struggling, very little economic growth there. Perhaps she thinks that, she's going over, therefore, with being in a stronger position and that the EU might be needing to give something to her. But I think we all remember David Cameron made these visits over to Angela Merkel back in the day and came back with very little. So I think there is certainly something in. Are you going into this negotiation with a strong hand? Are you begging from people who are themselves begging? Should she in fact be going and making that trip to the US and shaking hands with an economy that's on the up and stock markets are doing very well? It certainly. I think I can see the logic in it. I'm just not sure it's going to work.
I suppose the response, and finally on this, Helen, is from the UK government. We heard this from the Prime Minister only last week, that he thinks we don't have to pick sides, that essentially we need good relations with our nearest and biggest trading partner, i.e. the EU, and we also clearly need a good relationship with the one that we have a special relationship with, i.e. the United States.
Well, trying to look both ways, is something that Britain has actually benefited from in the past. But I think we're entering a whole new world order here. We're going to have big winners and losers. You're going to want to show who your friends are. And those classic examples of, the enemy of my friend is my enemy, and all that world of Kissinger diplomacy is coming out. So look, Keir Starmer may not want to pick sides, but I think his hand will be forced. And the new world we're entering, you are certainly going to have to pick sides with the stronger economy. And that is where I see things going, where there would be more success over in the US.
OK, Helen, thank you very much indeed for your time with your very patriotic cushion or throw that you have behind you there. Thank you very much indeed, Helen Thomas, the Chief Executive of Blood Money. Thank you. Now, recruiters have said the demand for staff has fallen sharply as firms consider the effects of October's budget. A survey of 400 recruitment agencies found that permanent placements into jobs fell at the steepest level in over a year last month. Let's get more on this with Paul Dales. He's Chief UK Economist at Capital Economics. Paul, good morning to you. How bad are things?
Well, I don't think we should get too downbeat about this. I mean, the really big trends that are going to buffet and support the UK economy actually over the next few years are that inflation is much lower than it was. Interest rates are starting to fall. So I do think actually economic growth next year will be about 1.5% compared to about 1% this year. So we are moving in the right direction. We need to remember that. But there are some speed bumps in the road, and the budget was one of them. And businesses do seem to be responding to that by tailing back the demand for workers. And it just remains to be seen, really, how big this bump is. We're not really sure. My sense is we'll get over it, but there is a risk that actually it does mean that the economy is a little bit weaker, at least in the next 3 to 6 months, than I've been expecting.
And you talked about this being a bump and the budget being part of it. Do we have any idea how much it is part of it, in the sense that there were concerns even leading up to the budget that the government were almost talking down the economy, and that even that in itself could have proven a drag, and now with these tax rises, that it is an actual drag? Or are there other factors that we need to take into play here?
Well, tax rises are a drag on economic growth. That is the fact. The question really is, how big a drag is it going to be? And our work suggests that it won't prevent employment from continuing to rise. It just means that employment might not rise quite as fast as we previously thought. So we're talking about employment maybe growing by just shy of 1% next year, which isn't too bad. The other thing we need to remember, of course, is that there were other policies in the budget, and that was more government spending and more public investment. And both of those types of policies add to economic growth. And in fact, they tend to add more to economic growth on a 1 for 1 or £1 for £1 basis than increases in taxes tend to take away from economic growth. So that's another reason we need to remember that there are some supports for the economy in other areas. It's just a rotation of activity, really, away from businesses and towards the government sector. But the net result, actually, in a year's time, might be the economy is growing by about 1.5% a year, which is a normal pace of growth for the UK.
But Paul, let's be frank about this, though. Aren't the employment figures a bit of a con in the sense that, yes, the government talks about the fact that they are relatively historically quite low, but they don't take into account those that are long-term sick benefits, and that number has exploded in recent years. So actually, in many ways, they're not reflective of reality, if you like.
Well, reflecting reality is a real issue with this. So, like you, I've been concerned about this rise in the number of inactive people over the last few years. And that's essentially, it appears that there's a higher proportion of people who are saying that they are no longer willing or able to work. But new data actually is suggesting that perhaps the data that we've been getting on this is not quite as bad as it suggests. And in fact, the rise in activity might not be quite as stark or striking as we've all been led to believe. So it might be that the real mirage is actually the data we've all been looking at. And this is a real problem in the UK at the moment. The data the ONS is producing on the labour market, so employment, unemployment, inactivity, is just not reliable enough at the moment. Bank of England has made this point, the government has made this point, but it does mean we're a little bit flying blind, which really is not a great position to be in.
And just finally, very finally, Paul, when we talk about job vacancies and we talk about where things are a bit tougher now, where is this, by the way? What sectors of the economy seem to be struggling more than others?
Well, I think it's those sectors that are most exposed to the tax hikes and also the increase in the minimum wage. So if you think about hospitality, restaurants and food, those businesses are going to be paying a lot more in taxes, but yet they don't have the choice of not paying as much in wages because they're legally obliged to do that because they tend to employ a high share of workers at the low end of the scale. So I suspect it's those areas that are the ones that are really struggling. And at the moment, this is the time of year that's really, really important for those hospitality and retail sectors as well. So it's come at an awkward time for them, but hopefully they have a solid time nonetheless and make the most of what is a fruitful period for them.
OK, Paul, really appreciate your insight and analysis this morning. That's Paul Dales there from Capital Economics. Thank you very much indeed. Just going to bring you some breaking news coming into Sky News Centre in the last couple of minutes. It involves an explosion in Italy, not far from Florence, it appears. It reports that 2 people have died, 8 have been injured and 4 are missing so far. That's according to the rescue services who are dealing with this emergency. As I say, it's near a plant that stores fuel not far from Florence, the Tuscan capital, and the authorities are also asking anyone who lives within a 5-kilometre radius from the site explosion effectively to keep up to date with what is happening, because, as I say, we know that at least 2 people have died, 8 injured, 4 missing so far in that explosion in Italy. We'll have more on that at the top of the hour. And we're also just going to bring you up to date with some other breaking news, and that is the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, who is in the Gulf, as you can see today, meeting the UAE presidents. He flew into the Gulf last night. This is a visit, an attempted visit, to try and boost investments in the UK to deepen defence and security partnerships. It's a 2-day visit where the Prime Minister is visiting Saudi Arabia as well, but he is in the UAE today. As I say, these pictures just coming into us of meeting the United Arab Emirates president as they try to essentially strengthen relations, if you like, in the Middle East. It comes at a time, of course, we've seen Bashar al-Assad fall from power, if you like, in Syria, and the Prime Minister talking about how, in many ways, he is pleased to see that regime fall, but concerned about what may well follow. Let's bring you up to date with the rest of the day's business stories now, if we can, because China has announced its first monetary policy shift in almost 15 years as Beijing tries to boost growth. Citing a meeting of the Politburo, Chinese state media is reporting the country will adopt what it calls an appropriately loose monetary policy next year as part of steps to support economic growth. China last adopted an appropriately loose monetary policy after the 2008 global financial crisis, before switching to a prudent approach in late 2010. Volkswagen is holding a fourth round of talks with Labour representatives today over wage cuts and possible plant closures. The increasingly bitter standoff comes as Europe's largest car maker seeks to radically cut costs to compete with cheaper Asian rivals that have entered the market. Workers will stage strikes across 9 of VW's German sites. It's the second wave of walkouts in the space of a week. And house prices in England have increased twice as fast as household incomes over the past 2 decades, highlighting the difficulties that many people have had in affording a property. New figures from the Office for National Statistics show that the average annual household income was £35,000 in 2023, while the average house price was £298,000. Rises in house prices also outpaced wages in places like Scotland and Wales, but slightly more slowly than the national average. Now, let's stay with housing, because the Housing Secretary has said that local councils could be bypassed to fast-track house building. Speaking to Sky News, Angela Rayner suggested the government could impose housing on local authorities as it works to reach that government target of building 1.5 million homes by the end of this Parliament. Well, let's speak to Justin Young. He's Chief Executive of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Justin, very good morning to you. Do you think what the Deputy Prime Minister is suggesting is necessary?
Morning, Darren. Yes, absolutely. It's a real step in the right direction, because what this does, it'll accelerate the planning process, but it also still means that we retain that interaction, that consultation with local communities as well. So you will get things that are baked into a plan that can then move forward and don't get tripped up later on by hurdles that get thrown up by others. So you will get, an accelerated process. It'll provide more certainty in the planning system. So it's definitely a step in that right direction.
I suppose the question is, will it be enough? I mean, even today, people are suggesting that 1.5 million home target, which, by the way, some would suggest is inadequate in itself, simply will not be met within the next 5 years.
I think it's definitely a stretch, but there will be a number of things that need to come into play to help that happen. And setting the targets and changing the planning system is absolutely one of the key pieces. But there are other elements as well. And certainly when we look at the plans, we know that a lot of those plans that local authorities have do need reviewing. Now, at the moment, that's going to take resource and it's going to take time. And what is also happening in parallel is a transition to a digital planning system. So again, we need that to keep accelerating as well, so that we can get those plans put in place with this new process baked in and then ready for the housing target to be met.
Justin, then what would you say to the people who may well be sat at home, who are NIMBYs and quite proud NIMBYs, and suggest that actually they don't necessarily want to see the towns or villages transformed in a really disruptive way, and that in a democracy they have to be a big part, even if they want to be in an objectionable part of that process?
For sure, but let's remember that they are a part of that process and will continue to be a part of the process. But the idea is that they come earlier on in that whole process, and then once it is baked in, that consultation has been done, and so it is there and ready then to go. That plan is kind of fixed, and so it moves forward. But the real sort of all connected issues here are the fact that, as I say, because freeing up planning system is only a part of the answer, what we do need is more skills. And your previous interviewee was talking about this as well. We need more skills across the whole natural and built environment. And there's welcome announcements around an additional 300 planners. But of course, at the moment, those planners aren't people yet. They're just vacancies. So, we need to speed up the process of getting those planners in place. Remembering, of course, that there are a number of vacancies for planners anyway, before you add in those 300. So again, what that requires is a bit of joined up government that makes sure that we get all the skills coming through into both the natural and built environment, as we call it. So, yes, we know there are shortages on construction sites, and that's not just the skills around trades, but it's also project managers, it's also quantity surveyors. So we need to get that pipeline of skills running as well. So again, connectivity, with Department of Education, for example, making sure that we've got young people enthused about coming into this arena. These are critical things as well.
OK, Justin, thank you very much for your time. Justin Young there, thank you. You're watching Business Live on Sky News. Up next, we'll be looking at the markets. The FTSE up a little this morning. The details in just a couple of minutes.
In the last 5 years, more than 13,000 farmers have left agriculture in the UK.
Is it going to be viable for the future?
No farmers, no food! The frustration, the anger, the fact that so many of them are at risk of going bust has now become too much.
You've got to keep hope because one day it's going to be okay.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent.
It's scary what's happening in the country.
It's the illegal migrants that we don't want here.
How difficult is this to police tonight? Off the scale.
Having the police speak to us so starkly right in the middle of the riot showed just how serious the situation was. The water on board the barge contaminated with Legionella bacteria, an outbreak that was first revealed by Sky News. There have been questions for months over whether the support offered to asylum seekers on the Bibby is sufficient.
A cruel place to put human beings.
From busy cities to rural communities, we spend every day reporting on how big decisions impact real people. The last smoke and steam rises into the sky above Blast Furnace 4.
Today is a day in history in Talbot.
The closure means more than 2,000 job losses.
It just seems madness.
It is a highly contagious infection. South West Water did apologise again.
This is the revenge porn helpline.
They're helping terrified victims.
You've been a victim of a very common type of online crime known as sextortion.
We're making things better for people.
Stonehenge became the latest victim of Just Stop Oil.
Now I can say I've been to the orange Stonehenge.
Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Slay minutes, slay better. Slay better. Thank you.
OK, welcome back. Let's take you through some of those markets in details now, because in Asia Pacific, it's opened pretty positive this morning. In Hong Kong, the index jumped nearly 3% in its final hour of trade after China, as we talked about earlier, vowed a more proactive fiscal measures and looser monetary policy from next year. In Europe, the markets are currently mixed as investors weigh up what's clearly happening in the Middle East. Here in London, the FTSE is up around 0.4%, mostly driven by miners, actually, who've also reacted positively to that news from China. And as you can see, all the miners up pretty substantially this morning. Let's have a look at the currencies. And the pound is doing pretty well, up against both the dollar and the euro. And if we have a look at the price of oil, it's ticked back up a little, but relatively at under $72 a barrel. His It's not bad value for money for a barrel of Brent crude oil. Let's speak to Ross Moulds, Investment Director at AJ Bell. Very good morning to you, Ross. Let's talk about oil. Normally, when there is substantial turmoil in the Middle East, oil shoots up. Simply just hasn't happened this time. Why?
No, I think that's partly because Syrian oil output over the last decade or so has already collapsed to almost nothing, just 30-odd thousand barrels a day, according to official sources. So in that respect, there isn't a lot of supply to disrupt. And I guess that's the issue. What happens going forward under the new regime, whether they can get that supply going and whether they can get themselves back onto the international markets, good books, a future issue has been in the immediate term, very little supply disruption there. OPEC's jawboning last week in terms of production withdrawal hasn't really helped the oil price, and it's still stuck at near 12-month lows because really of ongoing concerns about demand, particularly from China, and also supply, with President-elect Trump still asking companies to drill and increase supply.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, really, and something we will come back to, I promise, at some stage. But I want to talk about mining as well. Stocks up across the board this morning.
Yeah, I think that's, as you mentioned, in response to the Chinese policy initiatives or talk of policy initiatives that we're getting from the Politburo today. President Xi Jinping asking for looser monetary policy in 2025 and promises of more fiscal stimulus. So a bit of a Pavlovian reaction. Markets have moved on to the mining stocks, Rio Tinto and Anglo-American, Antofagasta, Glencore as a result. But really what China's trying to do is not so much build more bridges and do more infrastructure again, but actually what it really needs to do is get consumer expenditure going and get the Chinese savings rate down. That isn't necessarily going to be a benefit to the miners, but the market doesn't seem too bothered about that this morning.
Ross, we have to talk about the biggest soap opera drama, I think it's fair to say, with Boohoo and Mike Ashley. What's the latest on this never-ending saga?
Yeah, it's still ongoing. Mr. Ashley, through Fraser's, is the biggest shareholder in Boohoo with a 28% stake. He's written another letter to the company saying that there shouldn't be a fire sale of assets because there are rumours of a sale of Debenhams by Boohoo. He's still expressing discontent with the recent managerial changes. And he's saying, look, he's here to help. If he gets a seat on the board, he can help operationally, help financially, maybe help them borrow more cheaply. And he's promising that he won't use any data he learns in that part of the Boohoo job for the benefit of the other parts of his empire. Boohoo are still pushing back on that, saying, no, you're out for this for yourself. We don't think this is a benefit to the company, the shareholders. So the Mexican standoff really there continues at the same time as there's still this, Times article about Boohoo's executives, past and present, saying they think they're being professionally stalked and surveyed by somebody, and they've called in the police to try and get it sorted.
OK, it's fascinating stuff. Ross Moulds, as always, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you, Ross. OK, that's it for me on Business Live for the moment. We're back, of course, at 4:30 this afternoon. Up next, it's the very latest news with Jane Secker, including the latest from Syria. Stay tuned for that, and I'll see you a little later on. Goodbye.